A police officer slammed the elderly black man against the airport wall, while travelers pulled out their phones and watched in silence. "You're under arrest," the officer barked, loudly enough for the entire terminal to hear. But less than 15 minutes later, the same officers would discover they had just handcuffed one of the most powerful federal judges in the country. Before we begin, comment your city and what time it is right now, because this story starts with humiliation in front of hundreds of travelers. But what happens next forces an entire airport terminal to confront something much darker than one bad arrest. It was one of the busiest mornings of the holiday season. Delayed flights, crowded terminals, armed police everywhere. And when an older black man quietly walked through Terminal C, carrying a worn leather briefcase in one hand, nobody imagined the entire airport would soon fall completely silent, watching officers panic in real time. The airport terminal moved with non-stop energy beneath giant glass ceilings flooded with bright morning sunlight. Travelers rushed between gates, dragging luggage across polished floors, while flight announcements echoed constantly through the crowded building. Business executives argued into phones near charging stations. Families struggled to keep children together through security lines. TSA officers monitored packed corridors with exhausted expressions after hours of delays and growing tension across the airport. Near the center of Terminal C, airport police had already become more aggressive than usual after reports of increased security concerns during the holiday weekend. Officers questioned travelers randomly, stopped people for identification checks, and patrolled aggressively through crowded seating areas, while nervous passengers avoided eye contact and hurried toward their gates. The atmosphere already felt tense long before the elderly man arrived. He entered the terminal slowly, wearing a dark charcoal overcoat over a neatly pressed suit. In one hand, he carried an old brown leather briefcase with worn corners, softened by years of use. His silver hair was cut cleanly, and despite the exhaustion visible across his face, his posture remained calm and dignified. He looked somewhere in his late 60s now, quiet, reserved, the kind of man most people would never notice twice. But several nearby travelers immediately noticed something else instead. He was black, older, alone, and moving carefully through an expensive, crowded terminal filled with wealthy travelers and armed airport police already searching constantly for suspicious behavior. Near a coffee stand beside Gate 21, Officer Daniel Mercer spotted him immediately. Mercer was young, aggressive, the type of officer who enjoyed authority too much. The moment his eyes landed on the elderly man slowly walking through the terminal, his expression tightened with suspicion. Nearby officers noticed the look instantly. Mercer watched the man for several seconds before quietly speaking into his radio. "Possible suspicious individual moving through Terminal C," he muttered. The older man continued walking calmly toward a seating area near the gate without even realizing police attention had already locked onto him. And within the next few minutes, the entire terminal would witness a humiliation nobody inside would ever forget. Officer Mercer approached aggressively with another airport officer close behind him, while nearby travelers instinctively slowed down to watch. The elderly man had just sat down beside the gate seating area when Mercer stopped directly in front of him. "Sir," Mercer said sharply, "I need to see identification." Several nearby passengers immediately looked over after hearing the command. The older man calmly looked up from the boarding pass in his hand. "Of course," he replied softly. He slowly reached inside his coat pocket while Mercer kept one hand near his holster the entire time. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Nearby travelers began staring openly now, while whispers spread quietly between rows of airport seats. The older man handed over his ID calmly. Mercer barely glanced at it before his expression hardened further. "What are you doing in this terminal?" The question immediately sounded wrong. Even several nearby travelers visibly reacted to the tone. The elderly man blinked slightly. "I'm waiting for my flight to Washington." Mercer crossed his arms. "Why are you carrying that briefcase?" The old man looked confused now. "Because it's my briefcase." A few nearby passengers quietly exchanged uncomfortable looks after hearing the conversation escalating publicly. But Mercer wasn't finished. "Open it." The older man paused briefly. "Excuse me?" Mercer stepped closer now. "Open the briefcase." The entire gate area had gone noticeably quieter. Travelers openly watched while TSA agents farther down the terminal slowly started paying attention too. The old man carefully placed the briefcase on his lap. "Officer," he said calmly, "is there a reason I'm being questioned?" Mercer's face tightened immediately after hearing the word questioned. "You match suspicious behavior indicators." The sentence hung heavily in the air. Nearby passengers visibly reacted, while the old man remained remarkably calm, despite the humiliation unfolding publicly around him. Slowly, carefully, he opened the briefcase. Inside were legal documents, neatly organized folders, and several thick case files stacked carefully beside an old leather notebook. Mercer stared down at the contents briefly, before looking back at the old man again with growing irritation. "Step away from the bag." The elderly man's expression finally changed slightly. Not anger, not fear. Disappointment. Deep disappointment. And somehow that quiet disappointment felt heavier than panic would have. Within minutes, the situation escalated beyond simple questioning. Mercer had now radioed for additional officers, while nearby travelers openly stopped walking through the terminal to watch the scene unfold. The elderly man stood quietly near the gate wall, while officers surrounded the open briefcase, inspecting papers spread across the seating area beneath bright airport lights. "Hands where I can see them," Mercer barked loudly. Travelers throughout the terminal now openly stared, while several passengers slowly raised phones to record the confrontation. One young mother quietly pulled her child closer, while an older businessman shook his head uncomfortably from nearby seats. But still, nobody intervened. The old man calmly complied with every command without resistance. "Officer," he asked softly, "may I ask what crime you believe I committed?" Mercer ignored the question entirely. "Turn around." The old man froze briefly. "Excuse me?" Mercer stepped closer aggressively. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Gasps spread quietly through the terminal. Even the second officer beside Mercer looked uncertain now. The elderly man slowly looked around the crowded gate area, filled with watching strangers, before quietly placing his hands behind his back. And then, in front of hundreds of travelers beneath the giant airport windows, Officer Mercer snapped handcuffs onto the elderly black man's wrists. Phones immediately rose higher across the terminal. Some travelers looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. But the most painful part wasn't the arrest itself. It was the silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody stepped forward. The old man stood there publicly handcuffed, while strangers watched him like entertainment unfolding in real time. Mercer pulled him roughly toward the wall beside the gate seating area. "You should have cooperated from the beginning," he muttered. The old man slowly lifted his eyes toward the officer. "I did cooperate." Silence spread again. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over crowds when people know something deeply wrong is happening. But nobody wants to be the first person to say it out loud. The atmosphere inside Terminal C slowly began shifting as more travelers gathered around the growing confrontation. TSA agents stood further down the corridor, whispering quietly, while airport employees nervously watched from nearby counters. Something about the arrest no longer felt normal. Mercer continued escalating publicly, almost like he needed the crowd to believe he was in control. "Search every document," he ordered another officer, while pointing toward the briefcase. The older man remained handcuffed beside the wall, calm despite the humiliation spreading across the terminal around him. Several nearby travelers now openly recorded everything on their phones. One younger TSA supervisor finally approached the scene carefully. "Officer Mercer?" he said quietly. "What exactly triggered the arrest?" Mercer barely looked at him. "Suspicious behavior. Possible security concern." The supervisor frowned slightly. "Has anything illegal been found?" Mercer's jaw tightened immediately. "We're still investigating." The TSA supervisor glanced toward the elderly man, standing calmly in handcuffs. Something about the scene clearly disturbed him. Meanwhile, another officer continued searching through the legal documents scattered across the seating area floor. Then suddenly, his expression changed. He muttered quietly. Mercer looked over irritably. "What?" The officer held up one of the folders slowly. "You need to see this." Mercer walked over aggressively and grabbed the document from his hands. At first, his face showed only annoyance, then confusion, then something else entirely. Nearby passengers noticed the shift instantly. The folder contained federal court documents, official judicial seals, signed legal orders. Mercer quickly flipped through more pages, while his breathing visibly changed. The younger TSA supervisor slowly stepped closer. "What is it?" Mercer didn't answer immediately. He stared at the papers silently, while color slowly disappeared from his face. Then the second officer quietly spoke the sentence that changed the entire terminal. "Judge?" Silence crashed across the airport gate. Complete silence. Even the crowd recording the scene suddenly stopped whispering. Mercer slowly turned toward the elderly man still standing calmly in handcuffs against the wall. And for the first time since the confrontation began, fear appeared in the officer's eyes. The silence inside Terminal C became suffocating after the word "judge" spread quietly through the crowd. Travelers who moments earlier watched the arrest with suspicion now stared at Officer Mercer with growing disbelief. Several phones remained raised, recording every second, while airport employees froze behind nearby counters, trying to understand what was happening. Mercer looked back down at the federal documents in his hands again, like he hoped he misread them. But the judicial seal remained right there in front of him. Official, federal, undeniable. The second officer beside him swallowed hard. "That's Judge Harold Bennett," he whispered quietly. The name immediately triggered recognition among several people standing nearby. One businessman near the charge station suddenly straightened. "Wait, the Judge Bennett?" Another traveler looked shocked. "Federal Appeals Court?" Whispers exploded softly through the terminal now, while Mercer's breathing visibly changed. He slowly turned back toward the elderly man still standing calmly in handcuffs against the wall. Judge Bennett remained remarkably composed, despite the humiliation surrounding him. No anger, no shouting, just deep disappointment visible in his tired eyes. And somehow that calmness made the entire situation feel even worse. The younger TSA supervisor stepped closer now, his face pale. "Officer Mercer," he said carefully. "Remove the cuffs." Mercer didn't move immediately. He looked trapped between pride and panic, while hundreds of eyes remained locked onto him from every direction inside the terminal. Judge Bennett finally spoke softly. "Interesting how quickly assumptions become actions." The sentence landed heavily across the crowd. Several nearby travelers lowered their eyes immediately after hearing it. Mercer finally stepped forward with shaking hands, and unlocked the handcuffs from Judge Bennett's wrists. The metal clicking open echoed louder than it should have beneath the silence filling the terminal. Judge Bennett slowly rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had tightened against his skin, while the crowd watched in complete stillness. One older woman near the gate quietly whispered, "This is horrifying." Nearby TSA agents now openly looked uncomfortable, while additional airport supervisors hurried through the terminal after hearing reports over the radio. Mercer attempted to regain control of the situation. "Sir, if there's been a misunderstanding..." Judge Bennett calmly interrupted him. "A misunderstanding?" His voice remained quiet, controlled, but now the disappointment inside it felt almost unbearable. "You publicly handcuffed me in front of hundreds of people because I looked suspicious to you." Silence again. Heavy silence. Nobody inside Terminal C could deny the truth anymore. The emotional atmosphere throughout the terminal had completely reversed now. Travelers who earlier avoided eye contact with Judge Bennett suddenly looked at him with sympathy, while openly staring at Mercer and the surrounding officers with disgust and disbelief. The social power inside the airport shifted in real time. One younger traveler finally lowered his phone and spoke loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. "He never resisted once." Another passenger immediately added, "And they still treated him like a criminal." The comments spread quickly through the crowd now, as people processed what they had just witnessed. Several airport employees stood frozen near the gate counters, while airline staff whispered nervously among themselves. Judge Bennett quietly bent down and began gathering the legal documents scattered across the terminal floor during the search. For a moment, nobody moved to help him. Then suddenly a young TSA employee stepped forward first. "Sir, let me help you." One by one, several travelers slowly joined in collecting papers from beneath chairs and across the polished floor. The terminal no longer looked like a public arrest scene. It looked like people realizing they had watched something shameful happen without intervening. Mercer stood completely still, while the younger TSA supervisor quietly spoke into a radio requesting airport command staff immediately report to Terminal C. The situation had now become far larger than one aggressive stop, because everyone understood the deeper problem hanging in the air. Judge Bennett carefully placed the final documents back into his worn briefcase before slowly standing again. Then he looked directly at Mercer. "Do you know the most dangerous part of this?" he asked softly. Mercer said nothing. Judge Bennett glanced slowly around the silent terminal. "Everyone here watched authority treat me like a threat." He paused briefly. "And nobody asked for evidence first." The words hit the crowd hard. Several passengers visibly looked ashamed now, while even nearby officers avoided eye contact entirely. The terminal itself almost seemed quieter after that sentence, like the entire building was processing what just happened together. Within minutes, senior airport officials and TSA command supervisors arrived at Terminal C, while more travelers gathered around the area after hearing whispers spreading through nearby gates.
But the situation was no longer simply about one wrongful arrest. The crowd had begun asking much bigger questions now. How many times had this happened before? How many innocent travelers were publicly humiliated because they looked suspicious? How many people lacked the power or recognition Judge Bennett carried? One TSA supervisor quietly reviewed body camera footage already uploaded from the officers involved while standing near the gate. His expression darkened almost immediately. "There was no probable cause," he muttered softly toward another official. Nearby travelers overheard the sentence instantly. Mercer's face lost more color with every passing minute now. The airport police captain finally arrived breathless through the crowd before immediately freezing after recognizing Judge Bennett standing near the gate. "Judge Bennett," he whispered. The older judge gave a tired nod. No anger, no dramatic speech, just exhaustion. And somehow that exhaustion carried more emotional weight than rage would have. The police captain immediately turned toward Mercer. What exactly happened here? Mercer struggled to answer now. He matched suspicious indicators. The captain looked horrified. That's your explanation? Judge Bennett quietly watched the conversation without interruption while travelers throughout the terminal continued recording everything unfolding around them. One older passenger finally spoke loudly from the crowd. "The problem isn't just him," he said while pointing toward Mercer. "The problem is everybody watched it happen." Silence spread again, because deep down, everyone knew he was right. Nearly an hour later, Terminal C felt emotionally drained. Flights had resumed boarding around the area, but travelers still whispered quietly about what happened near Gate 21. Videos of the arrest had already started spreading online, while airport executives held tense conversations with TSA supervisors near secured hallways farther down the terminal. Judge Bennett sat quietly near the gate now, with his briefcase beside him, while several passengers approached one by one, offering quiet apologies. A younger black traveler stopped briefly near his seat. "Sir," he said softly, "thank you for staying calm." Judge Bennett looked up at him carefully. "I wasn't calm because I wasn't afraid," he replied quietly. "I was calm because losing control would have made me look guilty to people already prepared to believe the worst." The sentence hit harder than anyone expected. Nearby travelers listening quietly lowered their eyes again, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. The younger traveler slowly nodded before walking away silently. Judge Bennett then glanced toward the giant terminal windows where planes moved slowly across the runway beneath the afternoon sunlight. "You know what hurts most?" he asked quietly toward the TSA supervisor standing nearby. The supervisor swallowed hard. "What, sir?" Judge Bennett looked back across the crowded terminal filled with strangers. "Nobody looked shocked until they learned who I was." Silence again. Deep silence. Several nearby passengers visibly reacted emotionally after hearing that, because it exposed the ugliest truth of the entire situation. People only became uncomfortable after discovering the elderly black man in handcuffs held power and status. If he had been an ordinary traveler, most of the terminal likely would have kept walking without thinking twice. As boarding finally began for Judge Bennett's flight to Washington, the atmosphere inside Terminal C remained heavy with reflection and shame. Travelers quietly moved aside, allowing the elderly judge to approach the gate first, while airport employees avoided eye contact entirely. No applause, no dramatic cheering, just silence. Respectful silence arriving far too late. Judge Bennett slowly handed his boarding pass to the airline employee at the counter. Her hands visibly trembled while scanning the ticket. "I'm very sorry for what happened today, sir," she whispered softly. Judge Bennett looked at her for several long seconds before answering quietly. "The problem isn't apologies." The employee froze. Judge Bennett glanced back across the terminal one final time, where passengers still watched him carefully beneath the bright airport lights. "The problem," he continued softly, "is how easily fear becomes permission." Nobody near the gate moved after hearing that sentence. Even the surrounding noise of the airport suddenly felt distant beneath the emotional weight hanging over the terminal. Judge Bennett picked up his briefcase calmly and began walking down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. And standing there, watching the elderly black judge disappear from view, many people inside Terminal C realized something deeply uncomfortable. The most frightening part of public injustice isn't always the authority abusing power. Sometimes it's the crowd silently deciding not to challenge it.